The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the nervous energy of 1,000 different species, their various forms of communication, creating a cacophony that would have driven most beings mad. Ambassador Zethkar of the Veltar Confederation adjusted his breathing apparatus nervously as he watched the massive holographic display showing the advancing Karthek horde. The Crimson Tide of Destruction had already consumed 17 star systems, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. The situation grows more desperate by the cycle, announced High Counselor Mordeth, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns across the walls. The Karthek have broken through our third defensive line. At their current rate of advance, they will reach the core worlds within 50 standard rotations. A collective shudder ran through the assembled delegates. The Karthek were not merely conquerors, they were exterminators. Every species they encountered faced the same fate, total annihilation. No prisonniers, no negociations, no mercy. They had emerged from the dark void between galaxies like a plague given physical form, their biomechanical ships powered by the life force of their victims. Ambassador Quillnex of the Hegemony raised one of his four arms, the gesture causing his translator to emit a series of harmonic tones. Our combined fleets have been reduced to 30% combat effectiveness. The Karthek adapt to our weapons faster than we can develop new ones. Their ships regenerate damage at an unprecedented rate, and their soldiers. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. Their soldiers are nightmares made manifest. Indeed they were. The few survivors who had escaped Karthek attacks spoke of creatures that defied conventional understanding. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in chitinous armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Their multiple limbs ended in razor-sharp claws capable of tearing through military-grade plating, and their faces bore clusters of eyes that glowed with an alien intelligence both ancient and utterly malevolent. Worst of all, they seemed to feed on fear itself, growing stronger as their victims' terror increased. "What are the other species?" asked Ambassador Lythera of the Singing Worlds, her melodious voice carrying undertones of desperation. "Have we contacted every civilized race in the galaxy?" High Counselor Mordeth's form dimmed slightly. "We have reached out to all known species with spacefaring capabilities. The response has been disappointing. Most have either already fallen to the Horde or have gone into deep isolation, hoping the storm will pass them by." "Cowards," spat General Vexron of the warrior clans, his massive frame bristling with barely contained fury. "They doom us all with their inaction." "Not all," Mordeth continued, ignoring the general's outburst. "There is one species we have not yet approached. They are relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only recently. Their technology is primitive by our standards, and their military doctrine appears to be based on concepts so archaic that most of our analysts dismiss them as irrelevant. Then, why waste time with them?" Vexron growled. "Because," a new voice interrupted from the chamber's entrance, "sometimes the most primitive approaches are the most effective." The assembled delegates turned to see a figure that many had never encountered before, a human. Ambassador Sarah Chun walked with purposeful strides toward the center of the chamber, her simple military uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by most other delegates. She was unremarkably sized by galactic standards, standing barely 1.8 meters tall, with no visible natural weapons or armor. To most of the assembled beings, she appeared laughably fragile. "Ambassador Chun," Mordeth acknowledged with what passed for surprise among her species. "We were not expecting Earth's representative until the next scheduled council session." "The schedule changed when we intercepted your emergency transmissions," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a calm authority that seemed oddly out of place given humanity's junior status in the galactic community. "We've been monitoring the Karthek advance for the past several weeks. Our analysts have been studying their patterns, their technology, their methodology." Quillnex's translator emitted what could only be described as a skeptical warble. "With respect, Ambassador, your species has been space-capable for less than a century. What could you possibly offer that our combined civilizations, with thousands of years of experience, have not already considered?" Sarah's smile was cold and sharp, an expression that somehow made several of the more sensitive species in the chamber feel suddenly uneasy. "You've been fighting them like civilized beings. You've been trying to match their technology, outmaneuver their strategies, defeat them through superior firepower and tactics. You've been fighting a war. Of course we have, Vexron rumbled. What else would you call it? What you've been doing isn't war, Sarah continued, her eyes scanning the chamber with an intensity that made many delegates avoid her gaze. It's a formal duel between honorable opponents. You follow rules of engagement. You attempt to minimize collateral damage. You try to preserve infrastructure and civilian populations. You fight like you expect to negotiate a surrender eventually. These are the principles of civilized warfare, Lythera protested, her melodious voice taking on a strident tone. Without such guidelines, we are no better than the monsters we fight. Sarah's laugh was short and sharp. The monsters you fight don't care about your principles. They don't follow your rules. They're not here to conquer. They're here to exterminate. And you're trying to defeat them with half measures and moral constraints. What exactly are you suggesting? Mordeth asked, her crystalline form flickering with what appeared to be curiosity mixed with apprehension. We're offering to help, Sarah said simply. But not in the way you expect. Earth won't be sending our diplomats, our scientists, or our peacekeepers. We won't be contributing to your conventional fleet actions or participating in your strategic planning committees. Then what? Quill next began. We're going to do what humans do best, Sarah interrupted, her smile growing wider and somehow more frightening. We're going to send our killers. The chamber fell silent. The term didn't translate well into most galactic languages, carrying connotations that made even the warrior species uncomfortable. Among civilized galactic society, the concept of individuals whose primary purpose was to end life was considered barbarically primitive. General Vexron was the first to speak. You speak of soldiers? Warriors? We have plenty of both, and they have proven insufficient against the Karthek. No, Sarah shook her head slowly. Not soldiers. Not warriors. Those terms imply structure, discipline, rules of engagement. What we're offering is something else entirely. Something that most of your species spent millennia trying to evolve beyond. She activated her portable hologram projector, and suddenly the chamber was filled with images that made many of the delegates recoil. They showed humans in various combat situations, but these weren't the clean, organized military engagements that most species were familiar with. These were brutal, chaotic, and absolutely ruthless encounters where every advantage was exploited, every weakness targeted, and victory was achieved through whatever means necessary. For the past 1,000 years, your species have been refining warfare into an art form, Sarah explained as the images continued to cycle through scenarios that violated numerous galactic conventions on armed conflict. You've created rules, established protocols, developed codes of honor that govern how civilized beings conduct themselves in battle. You've turned war into something that can be studied, predicted, and ultimately controlled. And this is wrong? Mordeth asked, her voice carrying a note of confusion. It's not wrong, Sarah replied, but it's not what you need right now. The Karthek aren't playing by your rules because they don't know your rules exist. They're operating on pure instinct, the instinct to survive and eliminate threats. To defeat something like that, you need to go back to basics. You need to remember what warfare was like before it became civilized. She gestured to the images, which now showed human forces employing tactics that made even the battle-hardened Vexron shift uncomfortably. Ambushes that violated every principle of honorable combat, psychological warfare that bordered on torture, and adaptive strategies that changed so rapidly they seemed almost random. What you're showing us is barbarism, Lythera said, her voice now barely above a whisper. Yes, Sarah agreed without hesitation. It is. But barbarism has one advantage over civilization. It's unpredictable. Your fleets move in formation. Your strategies follow established doctrine. Your soldiers behave according to training that emphasizes honor and duty. The Karthek have learned to anticipate this because it follows patterns they can analyze and counter. But what you're suggesting has no patterns, Quillnex observed, his translator struggling to convey the disgust in his harmonics. It's chaos. Controlled chaos, Sarah corrected. The difference is that our chaos has a purpose, to kill the enemy by whatever means necessary. No rules, no limitations, no concern for anything except complete elimination of the threat. The chamber fell silent again as the implications of her words sank in. What she was describing wasn't just a different military strategy, it was a fundamental rejection of everything that galactic civilization had worked toward for millennia. You're asking us to abandon our principles, Mordeth finally said. I'm not asking you to do anything, Sarah replied. Your principles are what make you civilized, and preserving them is important for the future of galactic society. But right now, in this moment, those principles are getting you killed. So we're offering an alternative. What kind of alternative? Vexron asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah's expression grew serious. Earth has approximately 2 billion individuals who have never fully adapted to civilized society. They exist on the margins, in the spaces between laws, in the darkness that most people prefer to pretend doesn't exist. They're criminals, mercenaries, sociopaths, and killers who have spent their entire lives learning how to survive and eliminate threats without regard for rules or consequences. You're talking about sending criminals to fight a galactic war? Lythera asked, her voice rising in pitch. I'm talking about sending predators to hunt other predators, Sarah corrected. The Karthek are apex predators from outside our galaxy. They've evolved to be perfect killers, and they're treating this invasion like a hunting expedition. You've been trying to fight them with the equivalent of farmers and shopkeepers, civilized people who learn violence as a necessary skill, but never embraced it as a way of life. And humans have embraced violence as a way of life. Quillnex asked. Some humans have, Sarah admitted. Despite thousands of years of civilization, we still produce individuals who think like apex predators. We've spent enormous resources trying to rehabilitate them, contain them, or redirect their instincts towards socially acceptable purposes. Most other species would have eliminated such individuals from their gene pool long ago. Why haven't humans? Mordet inquired. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. Because we've never been able to decide whether they're a flaw in our evolution or a feature. They commit crimes, cause social disruption, and generally make civilized life more difficult. But they also tend to be the ones who survive when everything else fails. And sometimes, she paused, looking around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. Sometimes you need people who specialize in making everything else fail. You're describing a release of chaos into the galaxy, Vexron rumbled, but his tone suggested interest rather than condemnation. I'm describing the release of 2 billion individuals who have no interest in preserving galactic civilization because they were never really part of it in the first place, Sarah clarified. They have no investment in maintaining the status quo, no commitment to fighting honorably, and no concern for minimizing collateral damage. All they care about is winning. And you believe these individuals can succeed where our combined fleets have failed? Mordeth asked. I believe they can do things your fleets would never consider, Sarah replied. Whether that leads to success depends on how badly you want to survive. The chamber erupted in discussions as delegates conferred with their advisors and constituents. The conversations were heated, conducted in languages and communication methods that created a babble of sound and light throughout the massive space. Some species were clearly horrified by the proposal, while others seemed intrigued despite themselves. Finally, Mordeth called for order. Ambassador Chun, what assurances can you provide that these individuals would limit their activities to fighting the Karthek? How do we know they wouldn't turn their violence toward galactic civilization once the immediate threat is eliminated? Sarah's smile returned, and once again several delegates found themselves fighting the urge to step backward. You don't. That's the risk you take when you unleash that kind of force. But I can tell you this. The Karthek represent an existential threat to all life in this galaxy. If they aren't stopped, there won't be a galactic civilization left to protect. And if we refuse your offer? Quillnex asked. Then, Earth will handle its own defense when the Horde arrives at our system, Sarah replied with a shrug. We've been preparing for that possibility since we first learned about the Karthek threat. But the rest of you will face them alone, using methods that have already proven insufficient. The delegates conferred again, this time with greater urgency. The mathematical projections were clear. At their current rate of advance, the Karthek would reach the galactic core within 50 rotations. Every major fleet engagement had resulted in losses for the defenders while the Horde continued to grow stronger, seemingly feeding off the destruction they caused. What would you require from us? Mordeth finally asked. Transportation, Sarah replied immediately, and intelligence. We need to know where the Karthek are, what their current disposition is, and what their likely targets will be. Beyond that, stay out of our way and let us work. No oversight, no coordination with our existing forces. None, Sarah confirmed. In fact, I'd recommend keeping your forces as far away from our operations as possible. The individuals we're sending won't distinguish between allies and enemies unless specifically instructed to do so, and even then, she shrugged again. They're not known for following instructions they disagree with. This is madness, Lythera whispered, but her voice carried across the chamber's acoustic systems. Yes, Sarah agreed cheerfully. It is, but it's also the only option you haven't tried yet. The final vote was closer than anyone had expected. 3/4 of the species represented voted to accept Earth's offer, driven by desperation and the growing certainty that conventional methods would fail. The remaining quarter abstained, unable to bring themselves to approve, but equally unable to offer alternatives. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out of the chamber, General Vexron approached Sarah. His massive form towered over her, but she showed no sign of intimidation. "I've fought in the border wars against the savage clans," he rumbled quietly. "I've seen what uncivilized warfare looks like. What you're describing sounds worse." "It probably is," Sarah admitted. "The individuals we're sending don't fight wars. They conduct extinctions. They won't stop when the enemy retreats. They won't show mercy to the wounded, and they won't take prisoners. They'll keep killing until there's nothing left to kill. And you're comfortable with unleashing that kind of force?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the holographic display that still showed the advancing Karthek horde. "I've spent most of my career trying to keep those individuals contained and controlled. I've argued for rehabilitation programs, alternative sentencing, and social integration initiatives. I believe in civilization general. I believe in the principles that guide galactic society. But I also know that sometimes civilization needs to be defended by people who don't believe in it," she finished quietly. "And if that's what it takes to ensure that civilization continues to exist, then I'm comfortable making that choice." As Vexron walked away, Sarah remained in the chamber, watching the crimson tide of the Karthek advance across the galactic map. In 72 hours, the first transport ships would begin departing Earth's penal colonies and maximum security facilities. 2 billion individuals who had spent their lives fighting against every attempt at rehabilitation or reform would finally have a purpose that matched their nature. She wondered if the galaxy would survive what she was about to unleash. Then, she looked at the advancing horde and realized it might not survive if she didn't. The choice, when viewed that way, became much simpler. The transport ship Redemptions and drifted through the void between stars, its hull scarred and pitted from decades of service in the deepest, darkest corners of human space. Captain Elena Vasquez had commanded prisoner transport vessels for 15 years, but she had never carried cargo quite like this. 2,000 of Earth's most violent criminals were secured in the ship's modified cargo holds, each one selected for their particular combination of lethality, adaptability, and complete disregard for conventional rules of engagement. The selection process had been unlike anything in human history. Every maximum security prison, every black site detention facility, every military penal colony had been scoured for individuals who met the criteria. They weren't looking for the merely dangerous. They needed the genuinely unhinged. Murderers who had developed new ways to kill. Terrorists who had invented novel forms of chaos. Military personnel who had been court-martialed for actions too extreme, even for wartime. In the deepest levels of the ship, Marcus Ghost Riley sat in his containment cell, methodically sharpening a piece of metal he had somehow extracted from his restraints. Ghost had earned his nickname during the siege of New Jakarta, where he had spent 3 months behind enemy lines conducting a one-man war of terror that left an entire planetary garrison afraid to leave their bunkers. His methods had been so effective and so brutal that his own commanders had ordered him court-martialed once the fighting ended. 3 cells over, Dr. Yuki Tanaka reviewed technical specifications on her personal tablet, her mind already working on modifications to standard weapon systems. Before her arrest for conducting unauthorized biological weapons research, she had been one of Earth's most brilliant military scientists. Her experiments had crossed every ethical line imaginable, creating pathogens that could be tailored to specific genetic markers and delivery systems that violated numerous galactic treaties on prohibited weapons. The cargo hold, designated Alpha, housed the most dangerous specimens of all, individuals so violent that they had been scheduled for execution before the current crisis intervened. Sarah Martinez, known in criminal circles as the Surgeon, had killed 47 people using nothing but medical instruments, each death designed to cause maximum psychological impact on anyone who discovered the body. Viktor Kozlov had single-handedly eliminated an entire organized crime family, including their children, using methods that had horrified even veteran homicide investigators. Captain Vasquez tried not to think about what she was transporting. Instead, she focused on the technical aspects of her mission, delivering her cargo to the staging area where it would be distributed among smaller, faster ships for deployment throughout Carthek-controlled space. The galaxy's leaders had made their choice, and now it was her job to implement it, regardless of her personal feelings about unleashing 2 billion predators into the cosmos. The ship's communications system crackled to life, and the voice of Admiral Harrison filled the bridge. Captain Vasquez, you're approaching the first waypoint. Prepare to transfer cargo Alpha through Delta to the escort vessels. Acknowledged, Admiral, Elena replied, though her voice carried little enthusiasm. Beginning transfer procedures now. The process took 6 hours, as each group of prisoners was moved to smaller ships designed for rapid insertion in a hostile territory. Unlike conventional military transports, these vessels carried no defensive weapons, no communication arrays, and no identification beacons. They were designed to slip through enemy lines undetected and deposit their cargo with minimal fanfare. As the last transport departed, Elena found herself staring at the tactical display showing Carthek positions throughout the contested zones. The enemy had established a pattern. Overwhelming force applied against military targets, systematic elimination of civilian populations, and rapid advance to the next system. It was efficient, predictable, and utterly ruthless. She wondered how that predictability would serve them when faced with opponents who operated according to no recognizable pattern at all. The first indication that something had changed came from long-range sensors in the Zirian system, where a Carthek harvesting operation was in progress. The aliens had landed on 3 inhabited worlds and were systematically processing the populations for biological material that fueled their war machine. It was a standard operation that had been repeated dozens of times across the galaxy, and intelligence analysts expected it to continue for at least another week. Instead, the sensor readings began showing anomalies within 18 hours of the human transports reaching the system. Carthek ground installations were going offline in seemingly random patterns. Their patrol ships were disappearing without sending distress signals. Most puzzling of all, the bioharvesting operations had completely stopped, even though the facilities appear to be intact. Admiral Harrison studied the reports from his command center on Luna Base, surrounded by holographic displays showing tactical data from across the galaxy. "What are we looking at here?" he asked his intelligence chief, Colonel Rebecca Hayes. "Honestly, sir, we're not sure," she replied, manipulating the display to highlight the anomalous readings. The Carthek forces in Zirian system have lost approximately 30% of their ground assets in the past day. But there's no indication of conventional combat. No energy weapon signatures, no explosions consistent with military ordnance, no debris patterns that suggest fleet engagement. Could it be equipment failure? Some kind of malfunction in their biotechnology? That's what we thought initially, but the pattern is too specific. The losses are concentrated around key strategic points, command centers, communication nodes, resource processing facilities. Someone is targeting their critical infrastructure, but doing it in a way that doesn't register on conventional sensors. Admiral Harrison leaned back in his chair, a grim smile playing across his face. "They're here, sir. The releases," he clarified, "the individuals from the transport ships. They're operating in the Zirian system, and they're doing exactly what we hoped they would do. Colonel Ifroned. Sir, with respect, we have no communication with those individuals. How can we be certain they're responsible for these anomalies?" "Because this is what they do," Harrison replied, gesturing toward the tactical display. "Look at the pattern. It's not random. It's designed to cause maximum disruption with minimal detectability. They're not trying to defeat the Carthek in conventional terms. They're trying to make the Carthek afraid to operate normally." "Afraid, sir? Think about it, Colonel. The Carthek have dominated every engagement because they know exactly what to expect from galactic military forces. Fleets operating in formation, ground forces advancing according to doctrine, weapons systems with predictable capabilities. They've learned to counter all of that because it follows patterns they can analyze." He manipulated the display, highlighting the specific installations that had gone offline. "But this is something else entirely. Key personnel disappearing from secure facilities. Equipment sabotaged in ways that suggest the saboteur had intimate knowledge of alien technology. Psychological warfare tactics designed to make the survivors question everything they think they know about their enemy. As if summoned by their conversation, new reports began flowing in from other systems where human transports had made their deliveries. The Valkyris mining complex had lost contact with its orbital defense platforms, only to have them reactivate hours later with their weapons systems targeted at Karthek positions. The Mordeath research station had been completely evacuated after its Karthek occupiers reported unnatural phenomena that caused hallucinations and paranoid behavior among the garrison. How are they doing this? Colonel Hayes asked, studying the incoming reports with a mixture of fascination and horror. That's the beauty of it, Harrison replied. We don't know, and more importantly, neither do the Karthek. When you're fighting conventional forces, you can develop countermeasures because you understand their capabilities and limitations. But these individuals don't follow conventional patterns. They adapt, improvise, and create new methods of attack based on whatever resources they can acquire or steal. The most disturbing report came from the Thyssen system, where a Karthek command vessel had been discovered drifting powerless in space. When rescue ships arrived, they found the crew alive but traumatized, speaking of hunting ghosts that had infiltrated their ship and systematically eliminated their ability to function as a military unit. The vessel's biomechanical systems were intact, but critical components had been replaced with crude human-manufactured devices that caused the ship's neural network to experience what could only be described as mechanical psychosis. They turned a Karthek ship into a psychological weapon against its own crew, Colonel Hayes observed, reading the technical analysis. How is that even possible? Because the individuals we sent don't think like engineers or tacticians, Harrison explained. They think like predators. They study their prey, identify weaknesses, and exploit those weaknesses in ways that the prey never expected. The Karthek have biological technology that operates on principles we don't fully understand, but that doesn't matter to someone who's willing to experiment on living systems until they find something that works. The reports continued to arrive throughout the following days, each one describing incidents that defied conventional military analysis. Karthek ground forces abandoning fortified positions after their bioarmor began exhibiting signs of infection by unknown pathogens. Harvesting operations shutting down when key personnel suffered what appeared to be targeted psychological breakdowns. Command structures collapsing as communication networks were compromised by viruses that seemed to adapt faster than they could be countered. But perhaps most significant were the reports of Karthek forces changing their operational patterns for the first time since the invasion began. Instead of advancing with their typical overwhelming confidence, they were beginning to establish defensive perimeters around critical installations. Patrol routes were becoming erratic and unpredictable, suggesting that local commanders no longer trusted their standard protocols. Most telling of all, the rate of advance had slowed dramatically as resources were diverted to investigating and countering the new threat. They're doing it, Admiral Harrison said quietly as he reviewed the week's intelligence summary. They're making the Karthek fight defensively. Sir, what are the implications if this strategy succeeds? Colonel Hayes asked. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. If it succeeds, we'll have saved galactic civilization by unleashing something that might be worse than the threat we faced. If it fails, he shrugged. Well, at least we tried something different before the end. On the bridge of a captured Karthek vessel, drifting through the Nexus cluster, Marcus Ghost, Riley studied the alien control systems with the focused intensity of a predator learning new hunting grounds. The ship's original crew had been eliminated within hours of his arrival, their biomechanical implants providing valuable intelligence about Karthek neural architecture before their hosts expired. Ghost had never been interested in understanding alien technology in any academic sense. He simply needed to know which parts made things dead and which parts kept them alive. The distinction was surprisingly clear once you stripped away all the philosophical complexities that seemed to fascinate military scientists. His current project involved modifying the ship's bioneural network to broadcast specific electromagnetic frequencies that interfered with Karthek brain function. The aliens' mental processes operated on surprisingly narrow parameters. Evolution had made them efficient killers, but it had also made them vulnerable to disruption in ways they had never encountered. The beauty of the approach was its scalability. Every Karthak ship he captured provided more insight into their biological systems, and every modification he made could be replicated by others with similar skills. The network of human operatives was sharing information through methods that bypassed conventional communication channels entirely. Coded modifications to captured equipment, biological markers left in specific patterns, and improvised technological solutions that could be reverse-engineered by anyone with sufficient creativity and complete disregard for safety protocols. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had established a laboratory in the ruins of a Karthak processing facility on Kepler 442b, where she was conducting experiments that would have violated every biological warfare treaty ever written. The alien biotechnology operated on principles that were fascinatingly similar to certain theoretical models she had worked on before her arrest. The main difference was that the Karthak had actually implemented systems that she had only been able to theorize about. Her current project involved developing targeted pathogens that could be introduced into Karthak biomechanical systems through their atmosphere processors. The aliens required specific environmental conditions to maintain their cybernetic implants, and those same conditions could be weaponized with the right biological agents. Better yet, the pathogens would be transmitted through the very systems the Karthak used to maintain their technological superiority. Sarah, the surgeon, Martinez had discovered that Karthak psychology was remarkably similar to that of certain human personality types she had studied during her criminal career. They were apex predators who had never learned to cope with being prey, which made them vulnerable to psychological manipulation in ways that conventional military forces couldn't exploit. Her specialty had always been creating fear in her victims before eliminating them, and she found that the same techniques worked remarkably well on alien minds. The key was understanding that the Karthak experienced terror differently than most species. They didn't fear death, but they were absolutely terrified of losing control. Her methods focused on creating situations where Karthak forces found themselves unable to predict or counter threats, leading to psychological breakdowns that were more effective than any weapon. Viktor Kozlov had taken a more direct approach, focusing on the systematic elimination of Karthak command structures through methods that maximized psychological impact on survivors. His background in organized crime had taught him that removing key individuals could cripple entire organizations, but only if it was done in a way that made the remaining members afraid to assume leadership positions. The Karthak had a rigid hierarchical structure that depended on specific biological castes performing designated roles. By targeting the command caste with elimination methods that violated their understanding of how warfare should function, he was creating a crisis of confidence that rippled through their entire organizational structure. As reports filtered back to Earth through various covert channels, it became clear that the human operatives were succeeding beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. The Karthak advance had not only stopped in several systems, they were actually retreating from positions they had held for months. But success was coming at a cost that made even Admiral Harrison question whether the cure might prove worse than the disease. The individuals they had released were not merely defeating the Karthak. They were transforming the very nature of warfare in ways that would have lasting consequences for galactic civilization. The question was no longer whether they could stop the invasion. The question was whether they could stop what they had unleashed once the invasion was over. 3 months after the first human operatives had been deployed, the galactic situation had transformed in ways that no strategic analysis had predicted. The Karthak horde, which had seemed unstoppable in its advance toward the galactic core, was now fighting a completely different kind of war against an enemy that refused to follow any recognizable rules of engagement. High Counselor Mordeth stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Council, her crystalline form flickering with patterns that indicated severe distress. The chamber was only half full. Several species had withdrawn from the Council entirely after their home systems had reported disturbing incidents involving human operatives who seemed unable to distinguish between Karthak targets and civilian populations. The situation has evolved beyond our ability to control or predict, she announced, her voice carrying harmonics of barely suppressed panic. While the human strategy has indeed halted the Karthak advance, the collateral effects are beginning to threaten the stability of galactic civilization itself. Ambassador Sarah Chun sat in the human delegation section, her expression unreadable as she listened to the reports. She had expected criticism. The individuals Earth had released were not known for their restraint or their ability to follow complex rules of engagement. What she hadn't anticipated was the speed with which they had adapted to alien technology and tactics. General Vexron activated his personal display, showing a tactical map of the contested regions. The Karthek have abandoned 17-star systems in the past month, he rumbled, his massive frame radiating confusion rather than his usual confidence. Not through military defeat. They simply evacuated without explanation. Our intelligence suggests they are regrouping around defensive positions in deep space, apparently waiting for something. What could they be waiting for? Asked Ambassador Quillnex, his translator struggling to convey his bewilderment. Seraph stood slowly, drawing attention from around the chamber. They're waiting for us to behave predictably again. The Karthek are apex predators, but they're also highly intelligent. They've realized that they're fighting something they don't understand, so they've changed tactics from offense to analysis. They're trying to figure out what they're really dealing with. And what are they dealing with? Mordeth asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Something that evolution didn't prepare them for, Sarah replied. The Karthek developed in an environment where they were the most dangerous thing around. Their entire psychology is based on the assumption that they can predict and counter any threat through superior force and advanced technology. But they've never encountered predators who don't follow evolutionary logic. The main display activated, showing footage from the Kepler 442b system that had been captured by automated monitoring stations. The images were disturbing even by wartime standards. Karthek installations that had been modified into elaborate traps, biomechanical technology that had been corrupted to serve purposes its creators never intended, and evidence of psychological warfare tactics that violated numerous galactic conventions. What we're seeing here is the work of Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Sarah explained, highlighting specific sections of the footage. Before her arrest, she was one of Earth's most innovative biological weapons specialists. She's been studying captured Karthek technology and developing countermeasures that exploit vulnerabilities in their biomechanical systems. The footage showed Karthek soldiers whose cybernetic implants had been infected with what appeared to be technological viruses that caused them to attack their own forces. Biomechanical vehicles that had been reprogrammed to serve as mobile weapon platforms against their original owners. Most disturbing of all, evidence that the aliens' atmosphere processors have been modified to disperse airborne agents that cause specific neurological effects in Karthek physiology. This is biological warfare, protested Ambassador Lythera, her melodious voice taking on harsh overtones. It violates every treaty governing the use of such weapons. The Karthek aren't signatories to those treaties, Sarah pointed out. More importantly, conventional biological weapons wouldn't be effective against their technology-based physiology. What Dr. Tanaka has developed targets the interface between biological and mechanical systems that makes their civilization possible. She's not just killing them, General Vexron observed, studying the tactical data with professional interest. She's making their own technology turn against them. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And that's just one individual. We released 2,000 like her, each with their own specialties and methods. The next series of reports detailed operations conducted by Marcus Ghost Riley, whose activities had completely disrupted Karthek communications networks across 3 sectors. Unlike conventional electronic warfare, which attempted to jam or intercept communications, Ghost had developed methods for corrupting the information itself at the source. He's teaching their communication systems to lie to them, Colonel Hayes explained during her briefing from Earth Command. Karthek neural networks are designed to process information with absolute precision. They don't have psychological mechanisms for dealing with deliberately false data. So when their own systems start feeding them contradictory intelligence, their command structure begins to break down. The psychological implications were staggering. The Karthek had evolved as perfect predators partly because they could trust their sensory input completely. When that trust was violated by their own technology, it created a form of existential crisis that their minds were not equipped to handle. But perhaps the most disturbing reports came from Sarah, the surgeon Martinez, who had established what could only be described as psychological warfare laboratories in captured Karthek facilities. Her work focused on understanding alien fear responses and developing methods to exploit them on both individual and species-wide levels. The Karthek experience terror differently than most species, Sarah Chan explained to the increasingly uncomfortable council members. They don't fear death. They fear loss of control. Martinez has identified specific triggers that can induce paralyzing anxiety in Karthek subjects. and she's been developing methods to broadcast those triggers through their own communication networks. The footage from Martinez's operations showed Carthag forces abandoning fortified positions not because of military pressure, but because their own psychological state had been compromised to the point where they could no longer function as effective soldiers. Entire garrisons have been found catatonic, their minds overwhelmed by carefully crafted stimuli that attacked the very foundations of their predatory psychology. "This is torture," Quill next stated flatly. "This is war," Sarah replied without emotion. The Carthag weren't interested in negotiating surrender terms when they were winning. They were interested in complete extermination of all life in this galaxy. The individuals we released are simply more efficient at achieving that goal than the Carthag were. Viktor Kozlov's operations represented the most direct approach to the problem. Rather than attempting to corrupt Carthag technology or psychology, he had focused on systematic elimination of their command structure through methods that maximized impact on survivor morale. "He's not just killing their leaders," General Vexron observed, reviewing the tactical reports with obvious discomfort. "He's doing it in ways that make their replacement afraid to assume command." Kozlov's background in organized crime had taught him that fear was often more effective than force in controlling large populations. His elimination methods were designed to send specific messages to surviving Carthag forces, messages that emphasized their vulnerability and the futility of resistance. "The psychological impact has been remarkable," Sarah explained. "Carthag command structures are beginning to collapse, not because their leaders are being eliminated, but because potential replacements are refusing to accept promotion. They've learned that assuming leadership positions makes them targets for elimination methods they cannot predict or counter." As the reports continued, a pattern began to emerge that made even Sarah Chun uncomfortable. The human operatives were not merely defeating the Carthag. They were fundamentally altering the aliens' understanding of what was possible in warfare. They were introducing concepts and methods that violated the basic assumptions upon which Carthag civilization was built. "What you're describing isn't just victory," More Death observed, her crystalline form dimming with what appeared to be depression. "It's the systematic destruction of an entire species' psychological foundation." "Yes," Sarah agreed quietly. "It is. And you're comfortable with this level of brutality?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, considering her answer. "I'm comfortable with survival," she finally said. "The Carthag came to this galaxy with the intention of completely eliminating all other forms of life. They weren't interested in coexistence, negotiation, or any form of peaceful resolution. They wanted genocide, and they had the technological and military capability to achieve it. So your response is to commit genocide against them?" "Our response is to give them a choice they never offered us," Sarah corrected. "The individuals we released are certainly capable of complete extermination. They've demonstrated that capability repeatedly. But, unlike the Carthag, they're also capable of stopping when they achieve their objective." "And what is their objective?" Quill next asked. "To make the Carthag afraid to continue their invasion," Sarah replied. "If that requires complete elimination, they'll achieve it through complete elimination. If it can be accomplished through psychological warfare and technological corruption, they'll use those methods instead. The difference is that they're responding to Carthag actions rather than implementing a predetermined plan of extermination." The philosophical implications of her statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The human approach to warfare was not based on strategic objectives or moral principles. It was based on adaptive responses to enemy behavior. The more extreme the enemy's actions, the more extreme the response would become. "But surely there must be limits," Lythera protested. "Some boundaries that even these individuals will not cross." Sarah's laugh was short and bitter. "You're thinking about this wrong. The individuals we released don't recognize moral boundaries. They recognize practical limitations. They'll do whatever works most efficiently to achieve their objective, regardless of whether it violates galactic law, military convention, or basic ethical principles. Then, what stops them from turning on galactic civilization once the Carthag are eliminated?" The question hung in the chamber like a death sentence, because everyone present knew it was the logical conclusion of the current situation. If humans could release such individuals to fight their enemies, what guarantee did anyone have that those same individuals wouldn't eventually view galactic civilization itself as a threat to be eliminated? "Nothing," Sarah admitted. Nothing stops them except the fact that we haven't given them a reason to view you as enemies yet. Yet, General Vexron repeated ominously. Yet, Sarah confirmed. But if you're asking whether we have a plan for controlling or containing them once the current crisis is over, she shrugged. We don't. That's a problem we'll address if we survive long enough for it to become relevant. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. The Galactic Council had accepted Earth's offer because they were desperate, but now they were beginning to understand the true cost of that desperation. They had traded the certainty of extinction at the hands of the Karthek for the possibility of extinction at the hands of their human allies. There is one more thing you should know, Sarah said quietly. The individuals we released are beginning to communicate with each other. They're sharing techniques, coordinating operations, and developing new methods that none of them would have conceived individually. What does that mean? Mordeth asked, though her tone suggested she didn't want to know. It means they're evolving, Sarah replied. They're becoming something more than just individual killers. They're becoming a collective intelligence focused entirely on the elimination of threats. And, right now, the biggest threat in this galaxy is the Karthek horde. And, when the Karthek are gone? Quillnex asked. Sarah's expression was unreadable. Then, I suppose we'll find out what they consider the next biggest threat to be. 6 months after the deployment began, the war that had threatened to consume the entire galaxy was effectively over. The Karthek horde, which had seemed unstoppable just a year before, had retreated to the dark void between galaxies from which they had emerged. But the victory had come at a cost that no one in the Galactic Council had been prepared to contemplate. Admiral Harrison stood in his command center on Luna Base, surrounded by reports that told a story of success and horror in equal measure. The human operatives had not merely defeated the Karthek. They had so thoroughly traumatized the alien species that survivors were fleeing the galaxy entirely rather than risk further encounters with their new enemies. Sir, we're receiving final confirmation from the Outer Rim monitoring stations, Colonel Hayes reported, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and unease. The last Karthek vessels have crossed the galactic boundary. Long-range sensors show them continuing to accelerate away from our local group. Any indication they might regroup and return? Harrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Negative, sir. Intelligence analysis suggests they're not retreating to regroup. They're fleeing in genuine terror. Whatever our people did to them out there, it was effective enough to override their basic predatory instincts. Harrison nodded grimly. The reports from the field had been increasingly disturbing as the weeks progressed. What had begun as unconventional warfare had evolved into something that defied classification entirely. The human operatives had developed methods of psychological and biological warfare that went beyond anything in recorded galactic history. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had created biological agents that targeted the specific neural pathways used by Karthek cybernetic implants, effectively turning their technological advantages into weapons against them. But her innovations hadn't stopped there. She had begun developing self-modifying organisms that could adapt to alien physiology faster than the aliens could develop countermeasures. Marcus Ghost, Riley had succeeded in corrupting Karthek communication networks so thoroughly that many units had lost the ability to distinguish between authentic commands and false information. His final achievement had been the creation of communication viruses that spread throughout their entire network, causing command structures to collapse across multiple star systems simultaneously. Sarah, the surgeon, Martinez had perfected psychological warfare techniques that were so effective they had driven entire Karthek garrisons to catatonia. Her understanding of alien fear responses had allowed her to create stimuli that bypassed rational thought entirely, triggering primitive terror responses that the aliens' evolution had never prepared them to handle. Viktor Kozlov had eliminated so many Karthek command personnel that their entire military hierarchy had collapsed. But, more significantly, he had done it in ways that left survivors psychologically incapable of assuming leadership positions, creating a species-wide crisis of confidence that paralyzed their ability to function as an organized force. The victory is complete, Harrison said quietly. The question is whether we can call it victory when the methods used were. Sir, Hayes prompted when he trailed off. When the methods used were so extreme that they fundamentally altered what warfare means, Harrison finished. We didn't just defeat the Karthek. We traumatize them so thoroughly that they may never recover as a species. With respect, sir, they were attempting to commit genocide against every other species in the galaxy. I know, Harrison replied, and I'm not saying we had any alternative. But the individuals we released have demonstrated capabilities that go beyond anything we imagined when we approved their deployment. The reports from the final operations were particularly disturbing. The human operatives had begun coordinating their efforts in ways that suggested they were developing a collective intelligence. They were sharing information, techniques, and resources through methods that bypass conventional communication channels entirely. More concerning was the evidence that they were beginning to modify themselves using captured Karthek biotechnology. Several operatives had incorporated alien cybernetic systems into their own physiology, creating hybrid beings with capabilities that exceeded baseline human limitations. Sir, we have a communication from Ambassador Chan, Hayes reported. She's requesting priority clearance for a direct briefing. Put her through, Harrison ordered, though his expression suggested he wasn't looking forward to the conversation. Sarah Chan appeared on the main display, her image transmitted from a location that wasn't immediately identifiable. Her appearance had changed subtly since the deployment began. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a coldness that suggested exposure to things that most humans were never meant to see. Admiral, I'm transmitting my final report on the operations against the Karthek, she said without preamble. The immediate threat has been eliminated, but we need to discuss the next phase. Next phase? Harrison asked. Ambassador, the Karthek have retreated beyond the galactic boundary. The invasion is over. The Karthek invasion is over, Sarah agreed. But the individuals we released are still operational, and they're beginning to ask questions about what their next objective should be. Harrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the climate controls in his office. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest they view the elimination of the Karthek as just the first step in securing the galaxy against threats, Sarah replied. They've been analyzing galactic power structures, military capabilities, and potential sources of future conflict. Are you saying they're considering other species as potential targets? I'm saying they're evaluating every species in the galaxy based on threat assessment criteria that prioritize capability over intent, Sarah clarified. They're predators who have been given a target-rich environment, and they're doing what predators do, looking for their next prey. The implications were staggering. The human operatives had been released with the specific objective of stopping the Karthek invasion. But their methods had been so successful that they were now looking for new applications of their capabilities. What are their conclusions? Harrison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. They've identified 17 species with the technological and military capability to pose existential threats to galactic civilization, Sarah replied. They're particularly concerned about the Veltar Confederation's bioweapons research, the hegemony's advanced artificial intelligence programs, and the warrior clan's military expansion into neutral territories. Those are our allies, Harrison pointed out. They were our allies when we had a common enemy, Sarah corrected. But the individuals we released don't think in terms of political alliances. They think in terms of threat elimination. And from their perspective, any species with the capability to threaten galactic stability is a potential target. Then, we need to recall them immediately. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested amusement. Admiral, we released 2,000 individuals who have spent the past 6 months learning to function independently in hostile territory, adapting alien technology to serve their purposes, and developing new methods of warfare that make conventional military doctrine obsolete. What exactly makes you think they would respond to recall orders? They're still human, Harrison protested. They still answer to Earth Command. Are they? Sarah asked quietly. Several of them have incorporated so much alien biotechnology into their physiology that they barely qualify as human anymore. Others have developed psychological profiles that suggest complete dissociation from normal human social structures. They become something new, Admiral. Something that exists beyond the authority of any government or military organization. Harrison stared at the display, feeling the weight of what they had unleashed settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. What do you recommend? I recommend that we accept reality, Sarah replied. The individuals we released have become the most effective military force in galactic history. They've demonstrated the ability to defeat enemies that our combined civilizations couldn't stop. They're not going to simply disappear because their original mission is complete. So what happens now? Now we find ways to channel their capabilities toward objectives that serve galactic civilization rather than threaten it, Sarah said. We give them new targets, new challenges, new reasons to direct their violence away from species we want to protect. You're talking about using them as a permanent military force, Hayes observed. I'm talking about accepting that they already are a permanent military force, Sarah corrected. The question is whether we can influence their target selection or whether we simply hope they don't decide that galactic civilization itself needs to be eliminated for the greater good. The communication ended, leaving Harrison alone with the enormity of what Earth had done. In desperation, they had released 2,000 of humanity's most dangerous individuals into the galaxy, hoping they could succeed where conventional military forces had failed. They had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, but success had transformed them into something that might prove more dangerous than the original threat. Sir, what are our options? Hayes asked. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the reports spread across his desk. Our options are limited, he finally admitted. We could try to negotiate with them, offering resources and support in exchange for their agreement to limit their activities to targets we approve of. We can attempt to develop countermeasures against their capabilities, though given their demonstrated ability to adapt and evolve, that seems unlikely to succeed. Or we can simply hope that their interests remain aligned with galactic stability. And if none of those options work, then we'll discover whether the cure we developed for the Karthek invasion was worse than the disease, Harrison replied grimly. In the months that followed, reports began filtering in from across the galaxy of mysterious incidents involving species that had been identified as potential threats by the human operatives. Nothing as dramatic as the campaign against the Karthek, but a series of subtle actions that seemed designed to reduce the military capabilities of civilizations that might pose future threats to galactic stability. Bioweapons research facilities suffering mysterious equipment failures that set their programs back by decades. Artificial intelligence research centers experiencing data corruption that destroyed years of work. Military expansion programs being hampered by supply chain disruptions that appeared random, but followed patterns that suggested deliberate sabotage. The message was clear. The human operatives were still active, still coordinating their efforts, and still working to eliminate potential threats to galactic civilization. But they were doing it on their own terms, according to their own assessment of what constituted a threat. The Galactic Council found itself in the unprecedented position of being protected by a force they could neither control nor fully understand. The galaxy was safer than it had been in centuries, but that safety came at the cost of knowing that their protectors were individuals who had been selected specifically for their ability to kill without remorse or restraint. Ambassador Sarah Chun submitted her final report to Earth Command 6 months later, though by then, her official position had become largely ceremonial. The individuals who had been released were no longer answerable to any Earth authority, if they ever truly had been. Her conclusion was simple and terrifying in its implications. We sought to save galactic civilization by unleashing killers who could defeat any enemy. We succeeded. The question now is whether galactic civilization can survive being protected by killers who view any potential threat as an enemy to be eliminated. The answer to that question will determine whether our species is remembered as the saviors of the galaxy or as the ones who replaced one form of extinction with another. The galaxy was safe from external threats, but it now faced a new reality. Protection by guardians who had been chosen specifically for their inability to be controlled or contained. Whether this represented salvation or simply a more sophisticated form of tyranny remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The age of predictable, civilized warfare was over. In its place was something far more effective and infinitely more terrifying. The protection of civilization by those who existed beyond its boundaries, answerable to no authority except their own judgment of what constituted a threat. The galaxy had been saved, but at a price that no one had been prepared to pay. And in the dark spaces between the stars, 2,000 enhanced killers continued their eternal hunt, protecting a civilization they had never truly belonged to from threats it might never see coming.